On my wedding day, my name, Danica Lell, echoed through a chapel packed with guests. But not one person from my own family stood there to witness it. 3 empty rows stared back at me like a silent accusation I still couldn't comprehend. And just when I thought being abandoned was the worst they could do, my father proved me wrong. He showed up later with police officers. That was the moment I understood the people who were supposed to shield me had become the ones willing to shatter me. And everything that came after started right there. The moment I stepped into the Stone Ridge Chapel, a heavy quiet settled in my chest. The old wooden beams overhead held the faint, clean scent of pine, and through the tall windows, winter light lay across the valley like a sheet of pale silver. Guests talked softly, their voices bouncing gently in the open space as if the mountains themselves were listening. Evan's hand found mine, warm and solid, but it couldn't stop the sharp ache rising in my throat. 3 rows on the left side of the aisle, rows meant for the people who'd known me since I was a child, sat completely empty. No jackets, no last-minute footsteps, no familiar faces turning to smile. Just absence, thick and intentional. I kept my back straight, pretending the hollow feeling inside wasn't growing with every heartbeat. A draft, colder than it should have been, slid through the gaps in the old boards, brushing against my dress like a warning. Even the candles near the altar seemed nervous, their flames twitching as if they knew the truth I was trying to ignore. When a guest whispered, just quiet enough to be heard, asking if anyone had come for the bride's side, the words cut straight through me. I didn't move, but the question buried itself deep, right where the hope for a different kind of day had once lived. I tried to breathe, but it felt like breathing around a fresh bruise. This was supposed to be a beginning. Instead, it felt like a final confirmation of something I'd been running from for years. They weren't coming. Not today, not for me. And even though I didn't understand why, the wound their absence carved would become the thread that unraveled everything else. 4 years before that hollow wedding morning, my world had already started to splinter. The fire began on the outskirts of Boulder, the kind that races through dry grass faster than thought. The wind screamed down the hills in angry, twisting gusts, hurling embers like sparks from a furious fire. By the time our family got the alert, flames were already licking at the old storage shed behind our house. My father stood in the yard, his jaw locked tight, yelling over the roar of burning wood. He'd spent 20 years fighting fires, and I'd grown up watching him charge toward danger without a second thought. But that day, when the shed caught, something in him shifted. He shouted at me to save the beat-up old ambulance he kept inside, a relic from his early service days, something he treated like it held the last decent piece of who he was. I heard him, but at that exact second, a thin, terrified scream shot out from the cabin at the north edge of our land. A child's voice, high and sharp and desperate. It cut through every other sound. Instinct and training crashed together, an instinct won. I sprinted for the cabin, heat searing my shoulders as I yanked open the warped door and pulled a little boy into my arms just as part of the roof gave way behind us. Carrying him out, choking on smoke, I looked toward my father. His eyes met mine, but there was no relief in them, no pride, just a look of pure betrayal, sharp and final. Behind him, the shed collapsed, swallowing the ambulance in a burst of flame. I didn't realize until much later that the fire had taken more than metal. It had burned up the last thing he believed proved his worth. In the days that followed, I learned what he told my brothers, that I'd chosen a stranger over my own blood. And those words stuck. They put down roots in our home, spreading through every quiet moment that came after. Weeks later, an elderly neighbor took me aside and confessed to something my father never mentioned. He'd been drowning in debt. That ambulance wasn't just sentimental. It was collateral for a loan he was counting on. Losing it wasn't just a financial blow. It was the collapse of the one thing he thought he still controlled. His rage, I finally saw, had nothing to do with the fire. It was about losing the last piece of himself he could point to with any pride, and I was the easiest person to blame. That moment became the quiet crack that would later split my family wide open. Months before the wedding, I'd still been foolish enough to hope time might have smoothed things over. I mailed the invitations to my father and brothers, slipping a short, handwritten note inside each one, unsure if they'd even be read. A week later, the envelope came back to me, unopened. The paper was chilled from the winter air, the edges curled where snow had melted and refroze. A postal stamp from Boulder was stretched across the front like a scar. No explanation, no note, just a text from my father hours later. Don't expect anything from us. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter and stared at it far too long, as if waiting for it to change, to show some sign of a mistake. But it stayed still, as unmoved as the people who'd sent it. Evan found me there, turning the wrinkled paper over in my hands. He didn't say a word, his silence kind, a stark contrast to theirs, which always felt like a door slamming shut. I tried to swallow the hurt, but it lodged under my ribs. Days later, Mrs. Abernathy, the neighbor who used to sneak me homemade cookies when I was small, called out of the blue. Her voice shook as she explained that my father and brothers were buried in debt and too ashamed to ask for help. That maybe the distance wasn't about anger anymore, but humiliation. For the first time, doubt crept in. Maybe the wildfire wasn't the only reason they'd pushed me away. Maybe they weren't trying to keep me out of their lives. They were trying to keep me from seeing how far they'd fallen. But the real twist settled in quietly, only after I'd hung up the phone. They hadn't stayed silent because they didn't care. They'd stayed silent because asking for my help felt worse than losing me completely. And that kind of pride, I would soon learn, doesn't just keep people from reaching out, it pushes them to take. It happened on a Monday morning, the kind where everything feels normal until it suddenly is. I was wrapping up a damage report when Evan walked in holding a thick court envelope, its red seal glaring against the paper. I didn't think much of it at first, but the second I saw the header, the room seemed to shrink around me. My name was listed beside the word suspect. The accusation, misappropriating family savings. The complainant, my father. For a moment, I felt pinned in place, like the cold air drifting through the cracked window had frozen me from the inside out. Reading further only deepened the confusion. The so-called missing money was from a savings account linked to my mother, an account I'd never even heard of. There was no signature from her, no sign she'd been involved. It felt like someone had neatly erased her from her own records. Then came the court's demand. I had to provide timestamps for a specific night, GPS logs, and work witnesses. Someone had told them I'd been seen near my father's property. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Whoever built this story wanted me trapped, not questioned. I flipped to the signature on the last page. It was supposed to be my father, but the writing was too smooth, too even. His real signature had gotten shaky over the years. This one looked painfully like the handwriting I'd seen on a birthday card at my brother Mark's place. The weight of it settled hard. This wasn't just my father acting alone. I woke to my phone buzzing under the pillow. The screen lit up with a message demanding I return the money. A short audio clip waited below. When I pressed play, a voice, slurred and edged with anger, hit me like a punch. I knew that voice. Evan heard it and confirmed it without a doubt. It was Mark. The knot in my chest tightened as I pulled out my mother's old documents again, searching for anything I'd missed. That's when I saw the pattern. 2 bank accounts opened months earlier under her name. Withdrawals that lined up perfectly with times both my brothers were in trouble. The math wasn't subtle. They didn't just need money, they needed someone to take the fall. Then I found a transfer for $900 attributed to me, but the digital trail led back to a bar where Mark spent most of his nights. At the time of that transfer, I'd been knee-deep in floodwater miles away. Whoever set this up didn't care about being precise, only about causing damage. Later that morning, tucked between bills in my mailbox, I found a handwritten note. The slant of the letters, the rushed angles, I recognized Luke's handwriting immediately. The threat was brief, warning that things would get worse if I didn't cooperate. The same handwriting had shown up in the court file. The truth settled over me with brutal clarity. It wasn't one brother or even just my father. They were working together, building a version of reality where I was the villain. And standing there under the dim porch light, I realized they weren't simply angry at me. They were desperate. Desperate enough to ruin me if it meant saving themselves. At 7:15 a.m., pounding on my door jerked me out of the thin sleep I'd managed. Denver was buried under fresh snow, the kind that makes the whole neighborhood look soft and still. But the moment I opened the door, everything inside me went rigid. My father stood between 2 Jefferson County deputies, snow melting off his coat, his face set like stone. For a heartbeat, I wondered if he'd come to talk. He didn't. He told them he was reporting me for breaking into his home. It felt like the floor tilted. He handed over a grainy video from a backyard camera, a hooded figure moving quickly across the screen, the timestamp matching the night the money supposedly disappeared. One deputy glanced from the footage to me, eyes nodding my height and build before saying the resemblance was there. My cheeks burned despite the icy air pouring in behind them. I forced myself to stay calm and pulled up my FEMA GPS log. The timestamp showed I'd been over 100 miles away on duty that entire night. One deputy nodded, but my father instantly claimed I could have hired someone. Even the officers seemed thrown by how far he was willing to stretch the story. They asked about shoe prints found in his yard. When I said I wore a size 7.5, they exchanged a look. The prints were size 11.5, exactly what Mark wore. My father hesitated, then muttered something about other visitors. That tiny pause told me more truth than anything he'd said all morning. But the final crack appeared when the deputies asked how he'd accessed the camera system. My mother had set the password years ago, and he'd never remembered it. Yet here he was with video he supposedly pulled himself. When pressed, he admitted Mark had sent it to him. Deputies examined the footage again and pointed out warped metadata. The hooded figure wore a type of beanie sold only at a store next to Rusty Bluff, the bar Mark practically lived at. My father couldn't look at me after that, his gaze fixed somewhere past my shoulder, as if meeting my eyes would break something he wasn't ready to face. And standing there with snow soaking into the doorway, I understood my family had constructed this entire scene. They wanted the deputies to leave with me in cuffs. They almost succeeded. I'd hoped the confrontation would be the breaking point, that maybe seeing the truth laid bare would slow whatever was spiraling out of control. Instead, a new blow landed before noon. A notice from FEMA arrived in my inbox. A complaint had been filed accusing me of misusing internal data. My Level 4 clearance was suspended, pending review. One short message, and suddenly my job, my anchor, was slipping away. Evan studied the attached letter and pointed out the handwriting instantly. The slanted letters, the heavy pressure on every Y, the distinct loop on the L, it was Luke's. The realization tightened something deep in my chest. My oldest brother wasn't just involved, he was actively trying to push me over the edge. Later, a coworker pulled me aside at lunch and mentioned someone had called the office 3 times, asking about my disciplinary history, digging for anything that could be used against me. My father had always believed a person's past was the easiest way to wreck their present. Hearing that tactic turned on me made my stomach turn. But the sharpest cut came that afternoon when a hospital bill addressed to my mother showed up in my mailbox. The payment had been made through an account in my name, an account I never opened. Someone had stolen my identity, created a paper trail, and handed it over as evidence. That evening, Evan pulled up the security footage from our street. Mark appeared twice in the recordings, standing under a street lamp, staring up at our window, phone in hand. Both visits happened the week before the court notice arrived. Evan's voice was low when he said they'd been planning this from the start. And as I stared at Mark's blurred shape on the screen, I understood something bitter and final. My family wasn't acting out of anger. They were acting out of desperation, and they were willing to drag me under to keep themselves afloat. Driving back to Boulder felt like forcing myself into a past I'd spent years avoiding. The old house stood exactly where I'd left it, quiet and hollow, the fence still scarred from the fire. A cold wind slipped through the charred boards, carrying that faint, unmistakable smell of ash. Stepping inside was like opening a door to a room I'd locked in my mind. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. In the kitchen, the lowest cabinet let out its familiar creak as I opened it. Beneath a stack of unpaid bills sat a leather-bound notebook I'd never seen before. Page after page listed loans under my mother's name. Each one ended with the same promise: Mark will repay. He never did. She'd hidden every one of his debts, carrying them quietly while the rest of us went on thinking everything was fine. The weight of what she'd protected and what they'd taken pressed hard against my chest. Outside, Mr. Peterson waved me over and admitted he'd seen strangers going in and out of the house for months. One woman stayed so long she practically lived there. His words snapped every scattered detail into place. The altered video, the wrong shoe size, the unfamiliar silhouette. I found Mark at Rusty Bluff, slumped against his car, drunk and defeated. He confessed more than I'd expected. They needed money. My father believed I owed them. And the woman in the video wasn't me. It was Mark's ex, using an old key. They staged everything, not out of anger, but out of pure desperation. The morning of the hearing felt colder than any Denver winter. The fluorescent lights inside the county building threw a pale glare over rows of wooden benches, and the air held that sterile scent of paper and dust. I stood before the panel, my hands steady even though exhaustion clung to every part of me. Across the room, my father sat stiffly in the complainant's seat, while Mark and Luke lingered behind him like shadows, unwilling to step into their own blame. When things began, the FEMA representative stepped forward with the GPS logs. The panel scrolled through the timestamps without expression. The evidence placed me more than 100 miles away at the rescue station during the exact time the video claimed I'd been at my father's home. Their conclusion was quick and matter-of-fact. I could not have been at the scene. For the first time, I saw a ripple of doubt move through the room. A technical analyst took the stand next, pulling up the backyard footage my father had provided. He explained how the timestamp had been altered, how the metadata showed the file had passed through 3 devices before reaching the police. The final device, he noted, belonged to someone named Mark Lell. My father shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, a tremor running through his shoulders as the panel turned toward him. I placed the leather notebook on the table. The panel leaned in as I opened it to page after page of my mother's handwriting, notes on every loan she'd quietly taken out, each one tied to Mark. And at the bottom of the last page, the line that had crushed me when I first read it, "Don't let Danica know." The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. It was the kind of quiet that comes when the truth no longer needs to argue. Then, the deputies escorted in a woman I recognized only from pictures, Mark's ex-girlfriend. Her voice wavered as she admitted she'd crossed the yard that night, wearing the hooded jacket, using an old key. She confessed they'd asked her to stage the break-in so they could claim I'd taken the money. They promised to settle her debts in return. The moment she finished, the panel issued their ruling. The accusations were false, the evidence fabricated. I was cleared of every charge. The file would be closed for good. I turned to my father, to my brothers, and said the only words that still felt true. I never took anything from my family. I only took back my life. My father bowed his head, and for the first time I saw not the man who'd raised me, but a man hollowed out by his own choices, smaller than the ashes he'd once stood so bravely against. 3 months after the hearing, Colorado breathed into spring. Snow retreated up the mountainsides, and wildflowers pushed through the thawed earth like quiet acts of courage. Life felt softer, lighter, as if the world had finally loosened its grip around my ribs. Lydia, a trainee I'd mentored years ago, a young woman who'd lost her father too young, reached out and asked if I would walk her down the aisle. She said she wanted someone who'd stood beside her when life was at its hardest. I agreed without hesitation, though a familiar ache settled under my ribs as the day drew near. When the church doors opened and music filled the space, Lydia slipped her arm through mine and leaned in close. Her whisper was barely a breath, yet it hit me harder than any verdict or confrontation ever had. "Thank you for showing up." The words wrapped around a part of me I didn't realize was still bruised. In that moment, standing in the warm glow of the sanctuary, it felt like someone handed back the piece of my own wedding day that had been stolen from me. Outside, the sun cast a golden light over the Rocky Mountains. Not triumph, not revenge, just peace. The kind I'd fought for. The kind I finally chose for myself. I can't choose the family I was born into, but I can choose the kind of person I become. And I choose to be someone who shows up, even when the people who raised me never did.